Hello, my name is Professor Karin Lesnik-Oberstein. I'm a professor in the English Literature Department at the University of Reading, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Daphne du Maurier's novel, Rebecca. Rebecca is a very, very famous text that you've probably read yourself, or if you haven't read it, you may have heard of the famous movie by Alfred Hitchcock of this novel. It's been very wide debated and discussed, and generally it's seen as a classic example of a modern Gothic novel, a rewriting of the classic Gothic genre. And I'd like to think with you about that. And I'd like to think with you about how we might think differently about some of the issues in reading a text like this. The first thing, of course, that we can always think about is that this text is called Rebecca, but it isn't actually in any sense by the character Rebecca. This is not the narrator of the text. The novel is about Rebecca, a character called Rebecca, but it's not narrated by Rebecca. It's someone else, the second Mrs. de Winter, whose first name we never get to know in the novel, who is telling the story. And it opens with that very, very famous, also from the film, very famous line, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." And Manderley is the house where much of what the I narrator recounts happened. So the first thing I want to think about is that a lot of people have talked about Rebecca as a kind of a mystery, and that's part of what makes it seen to be classically Gothic. There's a lot of death and a lot of mystery in this novel, a lot of questions about what actually happened. Who was this Rebecca? What happened to her? What did she do? And what happened according to other people? But actually, I want to think about the fact that there's something interesting in this being narrated by the second Mrs. de Winter. None of the things that happen in this novel are actually anything else than according to the second Mrs. de Winter. It's what she dreams, like in Last Night I Dreamt I Went to Manderley Again. It's her memory of her dream, in fact, because this isn't the dream itself. This is a memory of a dream. In fact, interestingly, what we can remember when we read a text like this is all the memory of the I narration. And this is true for all texts that are narrated by an I. Another famous example, for instance, is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. But what happens when many critics discuss such texts is that at one point or another, they kind of forget about this. Their interest then is in what happened to Rebecca. What was she like? Why is Maxim de Winter now married to the second Mrs. de Winter? And what is the mystery behind this? But I want to think about that if we forget about the fact that this is all the memory of the I, all about its past, we forget that none of this actually happened. All of this is according to the memories of the second Mrs. de Winter. This also means that all of this has already happened. Whatever mystery there is in the text is in the past. The narrating starts from beyond the end of the novel. That's why the first line is, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." That tells you that the I is no longer at Manderley. They have to dream that they return there, and they have to dream they returned there last night. So this isn't where the I is at present anymore at all. And its story is about how it remembers what Manderley was to the I, but also how it remembers what other people told her about the second or the first Mrs. de Winter, told her about Maxim de Winter, told her about what they thought and what they felt. But this is not what those people said themselves. It is also not what they thought themselves. It is only what the second Mrs. de Winter remembers. It is her story. In this sense, I want to think about the fact that we can read this kind of text to be about the narrator. It's about what kind of storyteller are they? What do they think was mysterious or secret or hidden to them? Rather than this being an idea of a kind of third-person narration. So in this sense, when I think about this novel, am I claiming that memory is faulty or biased? And I want to argue that this is actually not what I'm thinking about. Any memory is just that. It's a memory. Someone else might have a different memory, for instance, of a certain event. They may claim things did not go in the way someone else claims they did. But both of those are those person's own memory. If you, for instance, tell the story of your life, then your carers or your friends or your family who were with you at that time might have a different memory of your life, but that does not make your memory of your life wrong, because it is your memory. It is what you experienced your life to be. When we think about memory in that way, this means that memory is not faulty, it is just always various. It tells us something about how someone remembers their past. That tells us something about what kind of person we understand them to be. And this is the same thing when we read. In the same way, I'm not arguing that the second Mrs. De Winter is biased. Biased implies that we know there is also an unbiased view. But how do we know that? All we have is this story as told by the second Mrs. De Winter. We don't have another version. Even when in the text there are different claims about what happened and why, these are still all told by the second Mrs. De Winter. These are not competing views. These are all views which are presented by the second Mrs. De Winter. It is her memory of how people agreed or disagreed with her, whether they were kind to her or unkind to her, and this is all in her judgment, which again, I'm claiming is not a failure of her memory, it's not a bias of her memory. For instance, if you think someone doesn't like you, then that is genuinely your view. It isn't something that's biased. Even if someone else asks that person, do you really not like her or him or it or them, or whatever term you prefer, that isn't the truth, even if they disagree and they say, yes, I do like them. Even so, if you thought they didn't like you, then that was genuinely what you thought and felt. You can change your mind if someone then says, no, it wasn't the case, but it didn't make your initial feeling biased. It just made it what you thought or what you felt for the reasons you thought and felt it. If you then change your mind because someone has told you it wasn't the case, then that is still not unbiased in turn or biased. It is then that you've changed your mind and you have a different view, but it is still your view. When I think about Rebecca in that way, I can think, for instance, about the circularity of the plot, the fact that the beginning and the ending of Rebecca fall together, because the ending of the novel is about, again, the road to Manderley lay ahead. There was no moon. The sky above our heads was inky black, but the sky horizon was not dark at all. It was shot with crimson, like a splash of blood, and the ashes blew towards us with the salt wind from the sea. This is all already as they have left Manderley. And the beginning of the novel is after the ending of the novel, because it is all this memory of looking back. So when I consider how I read this novel, any sections of it, I keep thinking about this. I'm just going to pick up a passage for you and read a little bit from it, thinking about the issues that I've just suggested. Here, the second Mrs. De Winter says, I went and sat on the window seat in the library. This is about 2/3 through the novel. It seemed funny without Jasper. He must have gone with Maxim. The old dog lay asleep in her basket. I picked up the Times and turned the pages without reading it. It was queer, this feeling of marking time, like sitting in a waiting room at a dentist's. I knew I would never settle to my knitting or to a book. I was waiting for something to happen, something unforeseen. The horror of my morning and the stranded ship and not having any lunch had all combined to give birth to a latent sense of excitement at the back of my mind that I did not understand. It was as though I had entered into a new phase of my life and nothing would be quite the same again. The girl who had dressed for the fancy dress ball the night before had been left behind. It had all happened a very long time ago. This self who sat at the window seat was new, was different. So what I'm thinking about again is that this is all what the I is remembering of its past self, even as within the passage it remembers an even further past. And again, I've picked a passage almost at random because actually all of this is equally important. There is no part of a text like Rebecca which is less or more important, and you could say of any text at all. The idea that some passages are plot and that they matter and that the other passages are just atmosphere or setting is in fact a difficulty if we think and remember and think about the I being the narrator of all of this. It is their story. So every detail matters because every detail tells you something about how they tell their story and therefore who they are. So for instance, it seemed funny without Jasper. Jasper is one of the dogs. But according to the I, this seemed funny. It's not that it was funny, but that it seemed funny to them. So the I is not making a claim that this is actually the case for them, but only that it seemed funny without Jasper. He must have gone with Maxim is a claim not to knowing that this is the case, but only that the I thinks that he must have gone with Maxim. This, in other words, is their guess or their speculation about what seems most likely, but is not actually the case. The old dog lay asleep in her basket. I picked up the Times and turned the pages without reading it. It was queer, this feeling of marking time, like sitting in a waiting room at a dentist's. Now, all these details are not about things that are actually happening. The I isn't reading the Times. They say so themselves. They say, I picked up the Times and turned the pages without reading it. It was queer, this feeling of marking time, like sitting in a waiting room at a dentist's. It's not that this is sitting in a waiting room at a dentist, but it's like it, according to the I itself. And that similarity is about the queerness of this feeling of marking time. So although this might look like I'm just reading some details from a passage, in fact, all of this is about a really important section of the novel, which is about the I having an idea that it has left its girlhood behind. That is, I had entered into a new phase of my life and nothing would be quite the same again. The girl who had dressed the fancy dress ball the night before had been left behind. This is according to the I looking back on that past girl. So there's a kind of double past here. So again, I haven't told you the plot of this novel. I haven't told you what the solution to the mystery is. Instead, today, I've thought with you about different ways of reading closely any section of novels which are narrated by an I narrator. How these are always, in every single I narration, about a present I telling the tale of its past self, through its remembered memories, dreams, dialogues, which are all according to its own memory, not dreams or dialogues that anyone else is reporting or can report. In this sense, I have just given a little example of how any I narration can be read as being most of all about what kind of storyteller tells this story, not what story is told. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this was of some use to you.